Hi everyone, welcome to week 5 of Quality and Performance Management. This week we are talking analytics and indicators. So we will talk about preparing your data set, working through it, and trying to figure out what you can get from that data that will give you measurable indicators for your performance. So it seems easy on the surface. Sometimes it is, but sometimes it can get quite complicated. So we're gonna walk through the process this week. Just a friendly reminder: assignments are due February 27th. I do advise you get on the assignments earlier rather than later, and that way, if you have any questions that pop up, you're able to reach out before it gets too close to the deadline. And then just that final reminder: the assignments are due 7:59 as opposed to the usual 11:59. So make sure that you're paying attention to that deadline. So first things first, indicators don't just appear out of thin air. Our performance evaluation has to rely on data. And if you're lucky, you have someone else collecting and cleaning the data for you. In most cases, you're on the ground collecting the data. You have to transform that data from whatever raw format that you get it in into something that is workable. Now, that can be anything from cleaning up the outliers within your data set. So I'll just give a really quick example. When I was in my master's and I was looking at the association between physical activity and anxiety, we asked a question of how many minutes of exercise do you do per day? And we got, you get the reasonable answers. You get 60 minutes, you get 90 minutes. Those are all, like, I can see someone doing 60 or 90 minutes. But when you see someone who reports that they do, up to 500 minutes a day of exercise, and that's on the high end and on the outlier side of the things, you have to start asking the question of, what do I do with that data point? It's the obvious inclination is that that's an erroneous data entry point. Maybe that person wanted to put in 50 minutes, not 500, but you still can't assume how to correct for that data. So we're going to talk about how we work with data, how we take that raw data, put it into that format of usability, and then taking the usable data and transforming that into our indicators. So here we go. Now, before we dive into what to do with the data, we have to kind of talk about the importance of data. Data is what drives our decisions, right? We capture our data. We're going to do our analysis with that data. That analysis is going to lead to the gaining of knowledge or information about processes or procedures. We can then develop actions based on that information, which are then going to generate outcomes, okay? Now, one of the things that you really have to understand is what you put into this cycle is what you're going to get out of it, okay? Now, where I work, we have a motto, and it kind of takes a negative spin, and it says garbage in, garbage out, which means if you get bad data and there's no way to kind of fix it, which if you have bad data, there's not much you can do with it, you're going to get bad outcomes out of that data. You can't really improve upon anything if data is inaccurate. You're going to get misinterpretations of the events that are going on the ground. That's not to say that your analyses are wrong. It's just the data you have is bad. Now, as kind of in any kind of data analytic position, sometimes you are at the liberty of the staff that are entering the data. Depending on where you're situated, you may be able to affect that. Other times you have to go to management teams to ensure that that data is inputted correctly. But this all stresses the importance of data quality itself. So like I said, it's very rare that you will get access to a database, or I should say to raw data, that you can look at and analyze right away. Very often you have to do something with it. Even if you do get raw data that is in a position to be analyzed right away, I'm going to tell you right now, you should not analyze it right off the bat. There are certain steps that you should do in preparation for your analysis before you even clean that data. The first thing, and again, it's highlighted and bolded here, so it's probably very important, but always start by understanding the data you are working with. So when I get new employees on my team, the first thing that they do, they get their orientation package, they get access to the databases, and then I will say for the next week, all you're going to do is play with the data. There's no assignments that they're responsible for. They are responsible just to go in, understand what the data is, understand the values that are generated, and start playing with kind of things that they come up with in their head, whether they want to play with graphing the data, understanding kind of the descriptive stats and the frequencies of that data. But they have a week just to play, because it's that important that I'm willing to allot time for that staff to just sit there and basically do nothing but stare at the database. I typically leave them alone so that they get that good understanding. Now, requisite information that you should know. Now, you won't always have a chance to understand all of it, but at least a partial knowledge is going to be better than no knowledge. First thing, and this is one that you should always know, is what the data represents, both the data and the process. So it really doesn't do me any good if I know kind of half of that. If I understand the data, but I don't understand the process that it comes from, I can't really make any kind of interpretation, right? I have to know both. How and where the data is being stored, that's somewhat important. Good to know. Where the data is being stored, absolutely important, because you need to access it. How it's being stored, it depends on the structure of the organization. The type of data is very important. You need to know what you're working with. So for those of you who work in R Studio, just try working in R without understanding the type of data that you have, and watch the errors just populate your screen. You need to know the type of data that you're working with. Next, you need to know what can logically be done with the data. Now, this is somewhat self-explanatory, right? You're going to have bounds on the data, and you're not going to be able to do certain analyses depending on what you have sitting in front of you. But there are other times where you can go down a pretty long path and then realize that what you're doing makes no sense, then you've wasted a whole bunch of time, right? Or even worse, you've developed something that makes absolutely no sense and you've handed it to a stakeholder or senior management. That's also not good. The last thing, and this is one that you absolutely should know, how can the data be transformed in order to be useful? So like I said, the data doesn't always come to you nicely packaged. You have to understand how to transform that data to turn it into something useful, like an indicator or a nice little visual for your dashboard. It's also important to spend time in the environment in which the data is being generated, so that you understand the nuances of that environment. So when I worked in long-term care, I was the quality manager. So I didn't have any care responsibilities. I didn't have any maintenance responsibilities. Again, same with like the nutrition and dietary departments. I had no responsibilities there other than to run their quality programs. But what I did was I would take time at least once a month to go on the floors and understand what's going on, understand the processes of what's happening, go down to the kitchens to see how everything is operating. And in that way, you can make your data more meaningful. So again, here we're talking about the process at which the data is generated from. Now this is a bit of a gripe, but it is one that if you work in quality or performance management, you will be well versed in going on rants about this. So processes are always changing, especially in the healthcare setting. And data stewards, the people who are typically sitting at a computer and running these kind of analyses, they're not always informed of these changes. I can't even count on my hands how many times I've run an analysis to hear that the process has been changed. And now this is something that I thought was pretty self-explanatory. When a process changes, you at least let the management team know. I learned that's not necessarily the case in long-term care. And it was typically after I handed in analyses, where I'd be informed, yeah, this doesn't apply that much anymore. We've changed this. So you must be prepared to pivot quickly. It's because of these instances that I started spending time on the floor a lot more than I first did. But it does pay off in the end. By putting putting yourself in that environment and essentially looking at real time what is going on. Now, that's not to say you should spend all your time there. Each environment is going to call for a different fraction of your time. Now, information that you should know regarding which process data is associated with it. So you should understand who performs the activity that is responsible for generating the data. So if you're looking at like hand hygiene data, you should understand who kind of the participants of, we'll call it an observational study for lack of a better term, but you should know who the participants of that observational study are. Are they the nurses and the PSWs, or are you doing hand hygiene that incorporates the kitchen staff as well, right? There are different outcomes for each one, right? Different implications. It's really bad if a nurse or a PSW is not washing their hands properly. It can be equally as bad if dietary staff are not washing their hands and preparing food, right? Both are going to be sources of potential infection and something you want to put a stop on pretty quick. The next thing is who inputs the data. Now, this might seem like a non-issue, but it's really important to understand, because going back to that data quality piece, if you know who inputs the data, you know who to ask if you see irregularities in the data itself. Also, you know who to pester if data is not being inputted. So there's two main things that go along with that one. The next is what type of data is being stored. This goes back to our previous slide. And then we have what data is required to provide the information to address quality or performance goals. Again, you're going to get this by being on the floor, seeing how things run, and trying to think of areas where you can generate data to tackle that issue. So for example, again, long-term care setting, you might be in an environment where residents are complaining about noise, but you realize that when nurses and PSWs are leaving the rooms, they're not closing the doors, right? So then you can look at kind of putting in some sort of quality measure and data collection of, maybe I go down to that floor and I'll walk the floor and I'll see how many doors are open without staff inside, right? And you can kind of, you can make it a multi-purpose trip to the floor, right? Because residents love when you pop your head in to say hello. You can, if you see an open door, walk in, hello, how's it going? Have a conversation with that resident. You'll make their day, but you're also collecting data to understand, okay, you know what, we have a problem with non-compliance, with staff leaving doors open when they shouldn't, right? Of course, again, there's caveats. Some residents might like their doors open. Again, if you're talking to the resident, that's some information you can get from them, and then you can understand kind of like, oh, well, this door is open because the resident likes it. It's not non-compliance. So that's just one example. There are literally millions of other examples of when it's important to be on the floor and keeping an eye out for those kind of things. So next we can get into data types. So I'm sure you're all aware of quantitative and qualitative data, but it is that important with performance and quality that we should talk about it again. Again, you should all know it, so easy stuff to go over. Quantitative data, that numerical data useful for statistical analyses, typically obtained but through observation, but not always. So we can use surveys and self-report tools. Then we have qualitative data, which is non-numerical data, which is more descriptive and opinional and is obtained through conversation and the relaying of experience. So think focus groups, semi-structured interviews, so on and so forth. Now, we do have other classifications of data. For example, improvement science also distinguishes between three types of data. So we have classification, count, and continuous. I just mentioned that because you may come across that, but for the most part, what you're going to see is quantitative and qualitative. It aligns with kind of the research field, so that's typically what we see. So just to drive home a point that we discussed earlier, the data type assigned within that electronic database is going to dictate what can be done with the data. So again, why data quality is so important. It is very possible that data is mislabeled within the database. I've seen it, especially with like date variables. They can be presented in a number of ways. They can be in the wrong format, and even though they're in the wrong format, they can look correct. This is going to cause problems for the analysis itself, so it's very important to identify the errors before attempting the analysis. Otherwise, it can lead to misinterpretations or delays in your analysis. it is a pain. It's always just easier to check as like a first step before you do your data analysis. Just make sure that you have the correct data types associated with each variable. Now, we also have 4 classes of data. So we have categorical or nominal data, which is non-numerical data belonging to non-ordered categories. So you can think of categorical data, pretty straightforward, right? Gender, sex, race, ethnicity. There's no order in the categories. It's different groups, right? There's ordinal, so data that can be categorized and ranked numerically. Difference between the categories do not matter. Then you have interval data, where data is measured on a scale. So the difference between values now becomes meaningful. And then you have ratio data. So differences between 2 values is meaningful and consistent, and 0 has a clear definition. Now, ratio is where most scientific measures belong. Again, driving the point home, it is important to look generally at your data before diving in. This is usually done through data summaries, but like I said previously, this can also be done by just going in and playing around with the database, right? See what you can generate, see what can be done, do it in like a non-pressure environment where you don't have any ad hoc requests coming in that are due with a specific time associated to it. This way, you actually get to learn, understand what's going on with the data, so that when those time-dependent analyses need to be completed, you know exactly what you're looking for. Data summaries are also a really good way to get that general overview of your data. It tells you what's inside that data set. It gives you kind of a read for your max, your min values, your outliers, as well as a bunch of other metrics if you so choose. So one of the things you can do is you can do a count of all the variables. Now what this count does is it tallies the values in a sample. Now you can do this for just specific variables. So it can look at, for example, the number of people on a unit within a long-term care home, right? So what it's going to look at, it's going to look at the unit or the floor variable, and then it's going to tally all the values in there. So if we use the assignment example, I think there's like maple, pine, and oak units in the data set. If you don't know what I'm talking about, you should probably go open up the assignment and look at the data sets. Even if you didn't pick it, you should probably look at both data sets before you decide. Just my opinion. But it'll give you counts for the number of residents on like the maple unit or the oak unit, so on and so forth. And it'll do this for all the variables. Counts are a bit of a pain when you look at continuous variables. Like you can think of something like age, right? You might get a count for up to 100 different values depending on the data set you're looking at. So it's got its place mainly for categorical variables. Minimum, lowest value, pretty self-explanatory. Maximum, again, pretty self-explanatory, highest value. Then you have the mode, which is the most commonly occurring value in a data set. You also have your median, which is the midway point in the data set. You have your mean, which is the calculated average of the data set. The variance, which is the measure of the spread of the numbers. So it's calculated through the distance from the mean. And then you have your standard deviation, which is how the data is distributed around the mean. So standard deviation, you can think of like the bell curve, and think back to stats class for that one. Looking at that big data picture, you always have to think about how your analyses are being interpreted, right? Not only just by you, but also by the stakeholder or senior leadership. So you have to remember that you are very close to the data. You've been working with it, you understand it. So when you create that dashboard, which is just absolutely beautiful, you think it's the best thing ever, and you send it off to senior leadership, they might look at it and be like, this means nothing to me, right? Because they view it differently than you do. Also, it does depend on what you present, right? If I just present an average alone, it doesn't tell me much of an in-depth picture. So if I look at, for example, average days spent in hospital, right? I can have someone who stayed there 1 day and then another person who has stayed there 5 days get an average of 3. Great, I have an average of 3. I could also have 2 people who have stayed 3 days and get an average of 3. So you're going to get a better interpretation if you present the average and the distribution as opposed to just the average alone. Now, there's a bit of a caveat with that, okay? So on the flip side, we also don't want to barrage people who are not used to stats with every possible calculated metric. You have to use some decision making here. What analytical pieces will tell the story that I need to tell, right? Do I give them average and the distribution, as well as a few other metrics? Will that be enough? Is it not enough? It all depends on, again, what you're trying to get across. Now, scatter plots and box and whisker plots, or just box plots, can be helpful visual tools to get the data across in a concise manner. These are not the only ones, but these are just 2 things that do work well. So if you've never seen a box and whisker plot, this is what it looks like. It compares the distribution between 2 or more groups to determine differences between them, and they can be used to determine which more complex analyses can be done. So recently, I believe I used these to determine if I needed to do an ANOVA test for my analysis, right? There's other things that we can do with these tests other than just kind of display this data alone. Now, you can see on the right-hand side of the slide, that was a lot more difficult to say than I anticipated, but you'll see how it's interpreted, the box and whisker plot. So you see the dots there, those are considered the outliers for that category. You have the upper extreme, the 3rd quartile, median, 1st quartile, and at the bottom, the lower extreme. So you're really interested in things like the median and the outliers, just to understand what's going on with your data. On the flip side, we have scatter plots, and this is used to determine if there's a correlation or associations that exist between 2 variables. We do this through the line of best fit. And the stronger the trend in either direction, positive or negative, the stronger the relationship. So again, this is not a stats class. I'm not going to go in depth with how to do this, but just 2 ways that you can start off summarizing your data and getting better insight in it. I use scatter plots quite often, actually, especially with the perspective of doing a correlation with the data that I have. Okay, so that's it for how we handle the data up to the analysis, or even leading into our dashboards. Just note that, again, not fully comprehensive. You can do any kind of statistical test with your data. This is just that, or I should say the last section was just all the steps leading up to that statistical analysis. Again, there are stats class for that. When we talk about the assignment, you don't have to limit it to what we talked about in lecture. Use your stats abilities, use your stats skills, branch out, be creative with that dashboard. Now we're going to talk about developing and using effective indicators. Again, this is a very broad overview, just to kind of get that ball rolling. I highly suggest reading the textbook for this chapter, and really for this last half of the course. It's a very useful tool, and yeah, strongly recommend it. Okay, so like we said previously in this lecture, raw data is rarely useful. I don't think I've ever been in a position where I've received data and went, yep, this is it. This is the final state. I've always had to do at least something with the data, whether it's cleaning it up because of errors or because I need to calculate different metrics. A good one, for example, in healthcare, unless you're working in kind of like a physio environment, at least from what I've seen, you're not going to get something like BMI calculated for you. You're going to get their height, you're going to get their weight, then you have to calculate it, right? By all means, at that point, you're stepping outside of the raw data you received. Indicators are a convenient way to display your data after using calculations and whatnot in the mix. So it is a convenient performance snapshot. So you're looking at your raw data and you're extracting meaning out of it. It clearly identifies outcomes critical to the organization. And lastly, it's essentially polished raw data. You're doing something with it. You get kind of, we'll use the old analogy, I think everyone uses it at least once, but right? You get like a rock, you polish it up, you get a diamond, right? Or whatever the analogy is. It's basically what you're doing with your raw data. You're doing something with it to make it usable and then presenting it to the people who make decisions. Now, I think I've said it a few times already, but I'm going to say it again because it is oh so very important. And I'll be quite honest, I see it so much when I go to conferences. But having a dashboard and or indicators and or visuals just for the sake of having them is rarely useful and often leads to confusion. If you don't need the graph, don't use the graph, right? If it's not your primary indicator, but you think it looks cool, don't use it. It just adds confusion. There are times and places for graphs. There are times and places for charts. You have to use your judgment. Some of this is experience to know when to use what. In other scenarios, the stakeholder will just tell you, like, this is what I want. Stick with that. But do not do stuff just for the sake of doing it. Always have that reason. Always have that story you want to tell. Now we're going to talk about measures, metrics, and indicators. And they're all very similar, and they all lead into one another. And the reason we're going to talk about this is because you might think something is not an indicator, and it's just simply a measure. But the truth is you can take something from a measure and a metric and bring it to an indicator. So a measure is a quantitative value that represents some aspect of care in our context, right? We're talking healthcare. So it's representing some aspect of care, or in a broader sense, it's linked to an organizational goal. Now think of your measure as kind of your raw data, right? It's taking the read of something and giving you value. The metric is a measure of quantitative data that is attributed for the purpose of monitoring or evaluation. So it has more focus and purpose than a measure. A measure, you might just be collecting it because it might be good one day, right? It sits at the side of the desk. Like if I go to the doctor's office right now, I mean, there's probably some people my age where we need to monitor their blood pressure, but for the most part, they're collecting my blood pressure to get a baseline, right? And then as I get older, my blood pressure goes up. They know it's now outside of my norm. At this point, right now, it's a measure, right? When we move from a metric to an indicator is basically a metric that has context assigned to it. So it has a tangible meaning. So if we take that blood pressure example, right? Actually, you know what? Let's do something a little bit clear cut because blood pressure can get messy. Let's look at something like BMI, right? So the measure for BMI, we'll say I walk into my doctor's office. The measure is going to be my height and my weight, right? That's the raw data. That it really doesn't have anything to do with it. The calculation of BMI is going to be the metric, right? There's purpose to monitoring it. My BMI gets too high, that could be indication of poor health. My BMI gets too low, it can be an indication of poor health. Okay, so keeping an eye on it, but there's no tangible meaning to it yet. Now, let's say that there's concern for my health. Now we're watching my BMI more closely. There's context assigned to it. It has a tangible meaning. If there's fluctuation in it, it has now become an indicator for my health. Okay, so that's how something like BMI, realistically, we started with height and weight, but that's how those things can be kind of polished to lead into an indicator. So again, indicators and metrics are very similar, and it's that contextual information that separates an indicator from a metric. So the indicator identifies good versus poor performance. Again, if my BMI is way too high and it starts coming down, the BMI is indicating that I'm having good performance in losing weight. Therefore, it is an indicator. It evaluates how close performance is to a standard. Okay, so it's been a couple years since I've had to understand the standard for what is considered healthy BMI. So you'll have to excuse me on not knowing the number, but there is a benchmark that you have to hit. So you can look at your BMI and you can understand if you are hitting the standard or if you're above or below it. It can also help determine the direction in which performance is trending. So if I take my BMI over the course of 6 months, I can see if my BMI is climbing and getting higher, or if it's going down, or if it's staying level, right? So that all gives contextual meaning to the indicator. Now, when we are thinking of creating our indicators or which ones to choose, we want to think of the story that we are trying to tell when developing the indicators and deciding how to visualize them on the dashboard. All right, so if we're looking at, let's say that I went to the doctor says that I need to lose weight, right? I'm at an unhealthy weight. I'm not probably going to display my vitamin C levels, like my blood work, on a dashboard, right? Let's say for whatever reason I have my own dashboard of health. I'm going to want to look at the metrics that center around what my interest is. I might be, like I said, my BMI might be too high. I might have high blood pressure. It's the things that are of interest to me, and if that's the story I want to tell, that's what I'm going to put on my dashboard. You want to put meaningful like packets of data on that dashboard. Now, key performance indicators, KPIs. They are a set of measures focusing on those aspects of organizational performance that are the most critical for the current and future success of the organization. Okay, so it's basically just a super important indicator, especially that organization. A lot of organizations will already have their KPIs set up. In the odd circumstances where you are creating the KPIs, typically you're going to tie that into the logic model and make sure that it aligns with one of the in-your-face objectives of that organization. It is very important to note that just as a logic model can be dynamic, it can change over time, so too must your key performance indicators. Okay, so you might have the same key performance indicator for a decade until it changes, but when it changes, like you have to be ready for that organizational shift, is basically what I'm saying. Now, there are 5 main characteristics of KPIs that work, that are good KPIs. The first is that they're expressed in non-financial measures. I personally have never seen a financial measure-based KPI in existence. They're not a good indication. It is measured and reported frequently. Okay, so something that's measured probably on the daily, if not more frequently, so you can get a good measurement into the trend, what's going on. They are acted upon by senior management and key decision makers, that is, that are paying attention to it. So believe it or not, this can fall under kind of your job responsibilities. As someone in quality or performance management, you have to stress the importance of certain key performance indicators and why senior management should care and should act upon them. Another kind of part of your responsibilities, all staff must understand both the measure and the particular corrective action required. So you should be talking to staff and say, hey, you know what? Hand hygiene is really important, and when our scores are low, we really need to do something important about it. So something kind of like wash your hands, right? Wash your hands properly, because that has implications to patient safety. And lastly, it ties responsibility of performance and action to the individual or the team. So without KPIs, it's really easy for a team to kind of stick their head in the sand and say, hey, we're doing a great job. And when someone says, how do you know? They're just like, well, look at this place. It's still standing. True story, I have heard that out of management's mouth before. However, when you have KPIs and you look at the scores and the scores are dreadful, and you talk to that same staffer and you say, hey, like, how do you think your team's doing? And they go, oh, we're doing great. And then you show them the scores. They're kind of hit with reality and they know that things need to change. They need to improve in a certain area. The stats don't typically lie, especially if you do them correctly. And it's really hard to justify poor performance by sticking your head in the sand and say, well, we're doing great. Additionally, there are two of the most important qualities of indicators are that they are relevant and actionable. So if an indicator isn't relevant, no one's going to care, right? It doesn't make sense to the organizational goals. If an organizational goal is to have the cleanest facility in Ontario, let's say, and you really want that everyone's doing hand hygiene, the halls are clean, all the gross smells that you would associate with like a hospital or long-term care, they're not there. But your key performance indicator is on like ER wait times. That's not really relevant to the goal of the organization. I mean, it's important in the broad spectrum, right? In our fantasy world, it's not important, but it's not relevant to what's going on in that organization. So it's probably not the best indicator to pick, right? Now, in reality, ER wait time is very important, and please do not confuse the fantasy world that I've constructed as an example with the real world. The second is actionable. So a KPI is useless if you can't do anything about it, right? Hand hygiene, you can do something about that, right? Now, and this is why kind of the non-financial measures are good, because if you put in financial measures, right, especially in a hospital setting, right, unless you're getting donations, you are pretty much stuck on what the government provides for you. So if you have a financial-based KPI that requires more funding, that's not really a reality. It's not actionable. You can't do anything about it. You can probably go get donors, but you need stuff that can be improved upon. Put it to you that way. It's not like you can just snap your fingers and build more waiting room area or something like that. So probably not going to have a KPI on like the density of the waiting room, in the sense of like, oh, we're using all our standing room, right? We need to build another waiting room. Kind of like that. Now, again, another theme that's popped up: as priorities of the organization shift, so too must your indicators and or dashboards to reflect the proper indicators of interest. These things do not remain static. You have to change as the organization shifts, or like we just talked about, your key performance indicators may be at risk of becoming irrelevant and inactionable. So you always want to make sure that they're relevant and actionable to the organization despite any shift that occurs. Lastly, we're going to talk about three types of indicators. So the first one is an outcome indicator. So it measures the overall system performance and includes, it can include, I should say, the voice of the patient and or customer and the results of improvement initiatives. So again, we can range into kind of the customer satisfaction thing. We can look at percentage of unplanned emergency revisits, adverse outcomes, stuff like that. The next one is a process indicator, which measures how well key components such as processes, workflows are performing. The other thing we can look at is balancing indicators. So provides a look at the system as a whole as processes and outcomes are improved, and it'll help identify unintended consequences. So one of these things is something like the changes to staff workload as improvements are implemented, and staff satisfaction. So pretty self-explanatory there on these three indicators. Yeah. All right, and that's it for week 5 content. So I must say it's one of my favorite things to discuss when we talk about quality and performance management, because we're talking about the tangible stuff this week, right? We're talking about taking data that you're going to collect at ground level. You're transforming that data into a format that's usable. And then with that transformed data, you're going to develop that into your indicators. And then from the indicators, you can get creative with how you display the information that's needed from senior management or from the stakeholders or whoever it is that you're creating metrics for. Now, I know this week was a little bit shorter than the usual weeks. That's okay. Let's just say use that extra time to work on your assignments. With that, remember, assignments February 27th, 7:59 p.m. And yeah, if you have any questions, reach out. And other than that, have a great reading week